Thank you for joining me for this Lifeway study of the book of Genesis. This is session 13, and it is Genesis 50, verses 15 to 26. The way I'm beginning the lesson is I'm using the example that's found in Go Explore the Bible that talks about the Israeli-Hamas war negotiations. And one of the questions in that material is what things are necessary for two sides in any conflict to reach an agreement. And of course, what it's looking for is trust, but that would be interesting to get your class's response from that. And then I want to move into the context. Genesis concludes with Joseph's words of reconciliation to his brothers, that's verses 15 to 21, and his words of instructions for his burial, verses 22 to 26. Now, these two episodes have in common the issue of loyalty. The brothers are questioning the depth of Joseph's loyalty to them as siblings. And secondly, Joseph is making a request that his brothers and their descendants will remember his bones and take them back to Israel. And it was a way of him demonstrating his commitment to the family and his commitment to God's promises. Before you jump into the lesson, it might be helpful just to take the time to just ask the class, what have you learned from the book of Genesis? We've been in it for these 6 months, and so is there anything new that was discovered in our study of Genesis, or was there anything that was a surprise about Genesis? What is it that you learned out of our study of Genesis over the past 6 months? And I'm sure that might be helpful to hear that. Joseph never lost sight that God has a plan and a purpose. And this caused him to approach life very differently than his brothers. The first point is message sent, Genesis 50, verse 15 to 18. Now, I have a backpack that I put my books in that I'm using to study for my sermon and for my Sunday school lesson, and it can get quite heavy. I'm bringing it to class, and I'm going to ask one of the younger men to come to the front, and I'm going to put that on his shoulders and ask him to carry that back cap and be seated for that point. Now, I'm not telling him I'm just doing it for the first point, but I want him to feel the weight and the heaviness of that backpack, and later we'll come back to it and take it off of him in sense of teaching this idea about forgiveness. So after I've done that, I'm going to ask him to look at verse 15. I'm going to give some explanation. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said to one another, if Joseph is holding a grudge against us, he will certainly repay us for all the suffering we caused him. Now finally, they admit that they were wrong. Now, why would they say this? Why, after 17 years, that's how long they've been there in Egypt, and Joseph has been caring for them, providing for their every need. Their father has died. Why would they say that at this time? They're uncertain about what he's going to do, maybe take his revenge on them now. And so I'm wanting the class to help give some reasons. Maybe it had to do with an uneasy conscience. Maybe it had to do with their family history, where Esau said of their father, Jacob, when the old man dies, I'm going to kill him. Maybe it had something to do with those kinds of things. Maybe it had to do with the fact they knew they deserved judgment. They were uncertain of Joseph's forgiveness. You know, when they went to take Jacob to be buried, Joseph probably had to go with the Egyptian party instead of with the brothers. And so maybe they saw something, if that was the case, maybe they saw something there that made them think he's really not forgiven us. But you can discuss that in the class. Then verse 16. So they sent this message to Joseph. Before he died, your father gave a command. Say this to Joseph, please forgive your brothers' transgression and their sin, the suffering they caused you. Now, there's no indication that Jacob actually said this. What the text does do is it does tie it to the brothers' fear. And so more than likely that's what's coming out. If that's the case, here's another one of their ploys, another one of their deceptions, instead of being honest with their brother. there used three words that refer to the sin that they committed against Jacob. The word transgression. It means to cross the line. It's in your leader's guide. It talks about, it can be translated as rebellion. It is a deliberate revolt. The idea of transgression is there is a line. You're not supposed to cross it. You know you're not supposed to cross it. You still step across the line in rebellion to the authority. They did that. They knew what was right and what was wrong, and they still chose to do what was wrong to Joseph. The word sin also has the idea of miss the mark. They knew how they were supposed to treat their brother Joseph, even though he's young and he's idealistic and he's saying these things that's irritating him. They know how one brother's supposed to treat another brother, and yes, they choose not to do that. Sometimes this idea of miss the mark is the idea of something falling short of the goal or falling to the off to the side of the goal. But also missing the mark can mean you're not even shooting at the goal. You're shooting at a different goal. And these men had sinned in that kind of way. They had done what no brother was supposed to do to any brother. And then this word suffering. The word means harm and abusive. It has the idea of something that has cruelty to it. It expresses a hideousness about an unjust behavior. This is the word that is used in chapter 44, verse 34, when the brothers told Jacob that Joseph had been killed by a wild animal and all they could find was his coat. It's a word that described the deep suffering that Jacob experienced over the loss of Joseph. And they admit these things. Please forgive your brothers' transgressions and their sin, the suffering they caused you. Therefore, please forgive the transgression of the servants of the God of your father. And here they make a reference to the fact they're willing to serve him. And Joseph wept when their message came to him. And again, the word talks about this deep sob that he has. It's not just he had a tear that he needed to wipe from his eye. It really just broke his heart that his brothers would do this. His brothers also came to him, bowed down before him, and said, "We are your slaves." There's a symmetry here for what Joseph had predicted when he was a boy is now being fulfilled as they're all standing in one another's presence as grown men. So I want to make this point to the class, that remembering God's plan and God's purposes is what shaped Joseph's life. So I'm going to put on the board two columns. One is the brothers' remembrance, and the second column is Joseph's remembrance. So what was it that the brothers were remembering? Things like their transgression, their sin. They were remembering their guilty conscience. They knew they'd done wrong. And then over here, Joseph came to understand that God had a purpose. God had a plan. He remembers that God was working to save the family and to save the nation and to save many other people. Joseph remembered things in a different way. And then after we've made those two lists of what the brothers remembered and what Joseph remembered, I'm talking about their thought life. Then I want to say, well, how did the brothers' way of thinking and remembering shape their lives? And it made them men of fear. It made them guilty. It made them unable to freely love their brother Joseph. And how did it shape Joseph's life? So the message is sent, and what we see is two completely different responses to the events that have been happening with them. Now I want to turn to the second point, truth declared. Chapter 50, verses 19 to 21. But Joseph said to them, "Don't be afraid." Now he's going to say this to them twice. "Am I in the place of God? You planned evil against me. God planned it for good to bring about the present result, the survival of many people." You see, he thinks differently about these things. "Therefore, don't be afraid. I will take care of you and your children, and he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. The word, I will take care of you and your children, that word I is emphatic. He's promising more than philanthropy. He's promising more than the groceries showing up at the door for them to be able to eat. He is saying, I'm personally going to be involved in caring for you. And then this last phrase, he comforted them, spoke kindly to them. We would say that he went out of his way to comfort and put them at ease. There are no words of blame here. There's no association of wrong. There's no reminiscing of the evil that they've done. All there is reassurance of these men. And your commentary will say that this phrase, spoke kindly to them, is to mean speak to their heart. And it was an expression that was used in the Old Testament in very difficult situations. So he did everything he could to put them at peace. Now there are three truths that Derek Kidner brings out about this passage in his commentary on Genesis. And I'm going to use those three truths as a way to apply this point. For example, the first truth is this: to leave all righting of wrongs to God, verse 19. He said that's the truth that Joseph is living his life on, to leave all righting of wrongs to God. And I'm going to have some folks look up 4 passages of Scripture in my class. Matthew 18, verse 21 to 22. Matthew 18, verse 21 to 22. Matthew 5, verse 38 to 42. Matthew chapter 6, verse 12. And Matthew 18, verses 15 through 17. And what you'll find is these are passages that talk about not taking revenge, not retaliating. And then after we've read those verses, I'm going to ask the class, how do these truths protect us from being guilty like the brothers? Or how do these truths help us not become people with grudges like they suspected Joseph was? So I'm wanting to know this truth, to leave all righting of wrongs to God. I'm wanting to know, how does that deal with guilt? How does that deal with us becoming or not becoming bitter people who want to take revenge? And I think you'll have a good discussion about that. The second truth is for verse 20. And again, Kidner says, to see God's providence in man's malice. To see God's providence in man's malice. Now, I have a rhetorical question for you. Who's more concerned with what happens to you? God or people? We obviously know that the one who has most concern with what happens to us is God. It's not even our family. It's not even the one closest to us. The one who is most concerned with what happens to us is God. Now, if that's the truth, then in the midst of our difficulty, shouldn't we be looking for how God is involved? Do you believe this statement? What others intended for our hurt, God uses for our good. What others intended for our hurt, God uses for our good. So Joseph saw God's purposes and plans in his brother's malice. And my question to the class is, how did that cause him to be forgiving? Again, he has an altogether different understanding and viewpoint of life than what his brothers do. In Joseph's viewpoint, he is bringing in God as a factor. Somehow or another, God is involved in this. God knows about this. So how did that cause him to be forgiving? To see God's providence in man's malice. The third point of this application is to repay evil not only with forgiveness, but also with practical affection. Verse 21, to repay evil not only with forgiveness, but also with practical affection. I'd like for them to look up Romans chapter 12, verse 20, and see what Paul says is our response to our enemies. Now, listen to this statement again, and I want you to listen for the habit. What is the habit that God is wanting Christians to develop. Listen to the truth again. To repay evil, not only with forgiveness, but to repay evil also with practical affection. What's the habit that Kidner is saying this verse is telling us we need to develop? And it's the practice, it's of consistently returning kindness to those who do us evil. Listen to that. You'll have to have the power of God to do that, to consistently return kindness to those who are evil. And do you see that in Joseph's life? And I'll ask the class for some examples. And then the supreme example, of course, is Jesus. Where do you see that in the example of Jesus? Now, the transition sentence for this part to the last point says, once they finally embraced Joseph's mercy and forgiveness, his brothers and their families were able to settle peacefully in Egypt. But while Joseph was busy taking care of the present, he also had an eye toward the future and God's ultimate fulfillment of his promises. So that leads us to the third point of the lesson, and that is promises assured, Genesis 50, verse 22 to 26. Again, I would read through this and give some explanation. Joseph and his father's family remained in Egypt. Joseph lived 110 years, and apparently 110 years was the ideal lifespan according to Egyptian viewpoints. And so that's just another example of the high esteem that was added to Joseph. He saw Ephraim's sons to the third generation. That could be his great-great-grandson, or even further than that. The sons of Manasseh's son, Machir, was recognized by Joseph. And the passage has the idea that he was on his knee. So it could mean that Joseph adopted these children to be his, or it could mean that the parents raised these children in the presence of Joseph. And Joseph said to his brothers, now that doesn't require that all of them be alive. It could be the sons of these brothers. But he said to his brothers, I'm about to die, but God will certainly come to your aid and bring you up from this land to the land he swore to give Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Joseph made the sons of Israel take an oath. When God comes to your aid, you are to carry my bones up from here. And Joseph died at the age of 110. They embalmed him, placed him in a coffin in Egypt. Now the last word in Genesis is the word Egypt. And that prepares us for the events to happen in the book of Exodus. Now to apply the lesson, I'm going to ask a question. Have you ever used binoculars? And if you have, what did you use them for? And my point that I'm going to draw from that is you use binoculars to make those things which are distant near. And what Joseph sees in the future is them going back to Canaan. And so he has them make an oath that which is going to be in the distance, and we know that's 430 years in the distance. Joseph didn't know that. Children of Israel didn't know that, but it's sometime in the distance. But Joseph has confidence that's going to happen, not because of an encounter and a revelation with God like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob did, but he's basing it upon his confidence in the word of God that he gave to those three men. And so Joseph takes the promise that was given to the patriarchs that wasn't fulfilled, and he says, this will be fulfilled. And so as a result of that, I want you to take my bones back to Canaan and bury there. So it was his way of also identifying with the Israelite family. Now, there are promises that you and I have about the future as believers. And so I want the class to name some of those promises we have about the future. Glorified body, our presence in heaven, eternity forever and ever, no longer suffering, being in the presence of Jesus. So all wonderful, wonderful promises. Jesus returning someday. And I want them to list those promises. And then I'm asking the question, in light of those realities, what are the choices we need to make? What's the lifestyle we need to make? If you're only living for 70 years, then you need to eat, drink, and be merry. You need to spend every dime on yourself. But if you're living for eternity, and this life, as brief as it is going to have echoes in eternity, you need to make some different choices. Some different choices about your relationship with God and its priority, your relationship with your church and its priority, your relationship in terms of your relationships with people. I mean, if you're living for eternity as opposed to living for 70, 80, 90 years, you're going to make altogether different choices. And I want to walk through that with the class. By the way, I forgot to have the guy take off the backpack back in point number 2 when it talks about forgiveness. So don't forget that about the guide. One of the gifts that God has given us to remember is songs. You probably learned your ABCs by singing them. And so God has given us this ability of music to help us remember. And so I have hymnals in my class, and I'm going to ask the class to look at the hymnals, and to find hymns that remind us about God's providential plans. And then I want them to name those hymns, and maybe even have them read the first verse, or we might even sing a verse or two of one of those hymns. But the point of this lesson is followers of God faithfully remember His plans and His purposes. And people who do that, they're as different as Joseph's brothers are from Joseph. God bless you.